They said to the judge, the reason why you need to take them into custody now is because they present a flight risk. But not just any flight risk, they said. This is what they argued. They present a risk of flight by suicide. The U.S. attorney literally told the federal judge in Arizona that you should take them into custody to make sure we get them before they have a chance to kill themselves. Now, if that doesn't make your stomach turn, I don't know what will. Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. It's Friday afternoon and it's another episode of just me talking. I did this a few episodes ago when I was in Oklahoma and I was lamenting about an unfortunate sentencing result and just speaking from the heart and hopefully delivering some information that was helpful. And I wanted to do it one more time. This is episode 99. We're getting very close to 100. 100 is already in the can, and I just wanted to give you a little teaser. It's going to be a pretty awesome special show talking about my favorite topic, which is mitigation videos with two incredible guests. But we also have, the three of us, a pretty major announcement about something I'm over the moon excited about. So I want you to promise me that you will come back in 2 weeks for that episode. The other thing I wanted to remind you of is we meaning myself and Patrick Barone, friend, colleague, a credible attorney from Detroit, Michigan, Birmingham, Michigan to be specific, have developed a live program incorporating his psychodramatic action techniques. It's sentencing and my story techniques for sentencing. And it's a 2-day live seminar. We did a double podcast about psychodrama at sentencing and wrote an article in the Champion. And you can get those episodes links in the show notes. And if you want to come hang out with us for 2 days and do some really, really groundbreaking, outside the box, amazing sentencing advocacy work with Patrick and myself, we would love to see you. There's a link in the show notes to register. There's a discount code in the show notes to register, 10% off. It's already super reasonably priced. But anyway, I just wanted to make sure you knew about that because it's coming up in a little more than a month, and we'd love to see as many of you that we can handle. There is a cutoff, and we're getting near full, but check it out. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. This is a topic that we address on Set for Sentencing pretty often because it's pretty important. And like I said, usually we're doing wonderful experts, other attorneys, sometimes even former clients to talk about the Federal Bureau of Prisons, what some inmates call, what we affectionately refer to as the BOP. Some inmates call backwards on purpose. I say that it stands for back off punishment or big old problems. I mean, it's just no secret that the BOP is absolutely dysfunctional, absolutely dangerous, absolutely dehumanizing. And I've been on a mission to tell the story of prison at sentencing in every single case I can. And more importantly, I've been on a mission to make sure that lawyers and clients know that it is super important to raise these issues at sentencing. Now, many of those issues will fall on deaf ears. Some judges won't either understand or believe you or care. It's not going to move the needle. But we have to keep telling the story because it's true and it's important. And eventually I have faith that more and more judges will sit up and take notice about the truth that they're telling, that we are telling them. And so, like I said, it's just me talking today, and I I'm a storyteller, so I thought I would start by telling you some true stories about the horror show that is the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So people need to understand these are real human beings and these are real stories and real tragedies. And it's happening all the time. I think what motivated me to do this episode, where I was just going to share with you some of these stories, was the most recent incident. I did a short TikTok on it, and it was on LinkedIn, and a lot of people have seen it and commented. That's why I wanted to build this out a little bit. But here's how it goes. I have a client who is currently at Terminal Island, which is a low security BOP facility in California, and he became friendly with another fellow inmate there who needed help with what's called a compassionate release motion. These are motions where, for various reasons, quite commonly serious medical issues, you can come before the court and ask for either release to home confinement or a halfway house or early release because, well, compassion, compassion. That's what that's what the inmates are seeking. They don't often get it, but this particular inmate had, before he had gone into custody, and it was a pretty relatively minor offense in the grand scheme of federal crimes because I think his total sentence was only something like only 14 months. I say only not to belittle how awful 14 months would be for anybody, but we know that in the federal system people could go for years and years and years, life. So 14 months, especially with all the earned time credit, it's probably a year sentence. But here's the problem. Before he was sentenced, he's had two very major heart attacks. And so he got sentenced. I'm sure this issue was raised before the judge at sentencing. I don't know that it was raised comprehensively by his lawyers because it usually is not. And again, we're trying to change that. But before he had to self surrender to serve his sentence, on his own, he took a lot of steps to alert the BOP to the seriousness, the severity of his heart condition. And what he did is actually made a specific request that he be designated to what's called an FMC, which is a federal medical center. It's essentially like the prison hospital. And that means you could get round the clock care. You have to be very sick to get into an FMC, but the care is there. That's what it's built for. That's what it's designed for. And he knew, based on his condition, that that was the place that was going to be the most likely not to kill him. And he sent all the records and he reached out to everyone he could, and the designation in Grand Prairie and everything else. There's emails to back it up, explaining the situation, begging them to take this seriously and put him in an FMC. He got a email back, probably like one line, cursory reply saying, nope, we decide where you go. And you're not going to a medical center. You're going to Terminal Island. Have fun, buddy. Okay, the email didn't say have fun, buddy, but it was just, one line. Just shrug it off. We got you. We got it. No problem. They said, we have a cardiologist there. You'll be fine. Which anybody who knows the reality of the staffing issues, the overcrowding, the underfunding, the reality of that on the ground knows to say that there's a cardiologist there. And there probably isn't a cardiologist that works there. They probably just contract with one near there. But to say that is so ugly and so indifferent and flat out. It's a flat out misrepresentation. If they were going to be telling the truth, they would say, look, we can't send you to the FMC for whatever reason. And we're going to send you to Terminal Island where if you're lucky, you'll see a doctor, I don't know, once a week, once a month. You're not going to be monitored. And God forbid anything goes wrong on the cell block. It's going to take a long, long time for any staff member to get to you because we're grossly understaffed. We're grossly underfunded. There's a policy in the BOP where they're having to take psychologists, medical people, nurses, the people that are not meant to guard the residents of the BOP on a daily basis are being taken off of what they are meant to do just to do run-of-the-mill guard duties because they're so understaffed. So what does that mean? That means they don't have the time or the resources to do what they're meant to do, which is to provide adequate medical and psychological care to the inmates. Anyway, so this gentleman reaches out to me on maybe a Thursday to engage my help in filing a compassionate release motion. And so I did a little research. I went on the docket, and what I found was that he had actually filed his own motion for compassionate release in front of the sentencing judge a month or so earlier. And the medical records from the BOP were given to the judge. They were filed under seal. I didn't see them. And the judge eventually denied the motion. This was maybe a week before or something like that. Or a couple weeks before, the judge had denied the motion, and I read her order in the Central District of California, and it basically said, well, we have two problems here. One is you filed it what we call pro se, meaning on your own, and that was improper because your lawyers who represented you at sentencing have never withdrawn officially from the case. So technically, you're still appointed, you still have a lawyer appointed to you, and so you can't file this motion on your own. I was super surprised by that. I didn't know that was a rule. I would think in a free society, a client, a defendant, an inmate, whatever you want to call them, could file their own motion and not have it denied by a judge because there was still some lawyer out there who hadn't yet withdrawn from the case. So that in and of itself was what we would call dismissed on a technicality. But the judge didn't stop there. She went further. She says, well, I've looked at your records. I'm not sure what her medical background was, but in her opinion, his situation with his heart condition was not nearly as dire as he was making it out to be. So, in other words, you're a defendant. By default, I'm not going to believe anything you say. You're the boy who cries wolf. This is an exaggeration. You're just trying to get out of serving your time. Get out of here. And so that was her order. Anyway, so flash forward, he's reaching out to me on a Thursday because he says, well, I better get a lawyer who can file this motion for me. Because those lawyers who are still on the docket didn't have anything left to do with the case, clearly. Anyway, and so that was on a Thursday. 2 days, like less than 48 hours later, I received notification from this other client's father that the inmate was dead. Yeah, he had gotten lightheaded, dizzy, collapsed on the cell block, and they took him away, and he died. Looks like from a heart attack. So I guess, Your Honor, his situation was just as dire as he was saying it was, and as the medical records that he submitted were saying it was, and as the medical records he submitted before he went into the Bureau of Prisons were saying it was. It's really hard for me to wrap my mind around that level of cynicism and indifference. And I guess people don't understand that sometimes this really is a matter of life and death. And when you've got the papers to back it up and everything, like, I don't understand. I just don't understand how something like this can happen. But the point is, I mean, I do. Sadly, this is not a one off. So for anyone saying, oh, it's an isolated incident, there's thousands of prisoners in the BOP, you need to understand. We hear this story or variations on this theme over and over and over again. And so I'll tell you another story. One of the first horror stories I had, I was handling a case several years ago, and I was brought in to do a mitigation video. This was a doctor, an MD out of New Jersey, and he was an older gentleman. He was in his 70s. And this is just to give you a sense of who we're sending to prison, which in the federal system, sorry to say, is just about everybody. It's different in the state. A lot of times people get probation in the state. In the federal system, And that was a big shock to me when I started federal practice 20 plus years ago. Everybody goes to prison. I mean, it's so rare that somebody gets a non-custodial sentence, but I guess it's like Oprah. You get a car, and you get prison. But anyway, this is what I'm talking about. Because the first question is, did we really need to send this man to prison at all? So he's a 70-something-year-old man. He's an MD. He had lived a exemplary life, never been in trouble before. His patients loved him. We had patients around the corner ready to go on video and talk about the kind of care that he gave them. And by the way, many of those patients were indigent and couldn't afford to pay him. And he made house calls in the projects in dangerous parts of New Jersey because he cared that much. He was, by all accounts, that doctor who we all hope we would have had throughout the course of our life, because that seems to me to be, a little bit of an anomaly at this juncture too. But that's the doctor. That's who he was. Now, what did he do? He got charged under kickback statute. So fine, it's illegal. There is a law. But let's think about this. There's a federal law prohibiting kickbacks when it comes to Medicare, Medicaid. And I guess you call that fraud, but if you look at the facts, what's happening here? When we think of fraud, we think of defrauding an elderly couple out of their life savings so they don't have retirement, they've lost their home. We think of fake magazine sales, we think of wire fraud. We thought, the things where a person is deliberately taking money from somebody under false pretenses. And there's a reason that's a crime and that's not good. And of course, I'm not condoning it. This kickback thing, it's a little bit of a horse of a different color because what is happening here? A patient comes to the doctor and they need blood work, which is like every patient, right? And this doctor refers them to a specific lab to do the work. And that lab would charge the right amount, do the right tests, and deliver accurate results. So there's no fraud in the delivery of these services. The client is getting exactly what they paid for. But the problem is this lab would give the doctor a small fee for all these referrals. That's a kickback. And because of that, the government was trying to put this 70-something-year-old doctor in prison for to the tune of about 6 or 7 years for that. And while he was awaiting sentencing, he was on release and he was diagnosed with cancer. And we went back to the judge and said, we need you to reconsider the sentence. He's, documented he's got cancer. There was no question he was diagnosed with cancer, the treatment that he needed and how long it would take. And I guess in the best case scenario, we wanted the sentencing pushed out a long, long time so that he could get the treatment that he needed before he had to go to prison. But in the best case, ultimately the right result would have been, okay, you're an elderly gentleman with cancer who's had an exemplary life. We'll just put you on probation or house arrest or something. But no, that's not typically how the federal system works. And I hope we all ask why that is. I don't have an answer. I have my theories and my thoughts, and I've shared them with you before, but you don't need to hear those now. It'll probably just get me in trouble. Anyway, all of it fell on deaf ears, and the BOP submitted. This is some first takeaway you need to understand. When you're doing this and you raise legitimate medical, psychological, other issues to the court to say, Judge, the BOP is not equipped to handle this particular person for these specific reasons. What will happen is the prosecutor will reach out to somebody in the Bureau of Prisons and they'll say, this lying, cheating, horrible defendant is trying to escape his true justice and by saying he has cancer and that you, BOP, aren't going to be able to help him deal with that. And what is the BOP going to say? Oh, you're right. It's pretty messed up here. I mean, that's what they should say because that's the truth. And you don't have to ask me. Go read the OIG reports. There's been a ton of them. There's a whole compendium of OIG reports in the show notes that you can download for free that'll tell you about all the problems facing the BOP. There's a reason Congress just passed a new law giving them more oversight because Congress knows the BOP is a shit show. The OIG knows that BOP is a shit show. And the press knows that BOP is a shit show because all you have to do is Google that, and there's story after story. Most recently, NPR did a whole series on how bad things are in the BOP. So you don't have to take Doug's word for it. Just go on the Googles, okay? But here's what I'm back to what I'm trying to tell you. The BOP will send what is essentially a form letter. They might tailor it a little bit to a case, but the government tells BOP you need to tell the judge everything's good. And so the BOP will send a letter to the judge. And I'm trying to collect these letters from every case I have. So if you're listening to this and you have this case and you've gotten one of these BS BOP, we got this, it's all good, judge, don't worry about it. I don't know what this dumb defendant's telling you, but they're lying. If you have one of those letters, send it to me, would you please? Because I'd like to compile all of them, and then eventually we'll have a nice little book that you can flip through and realize it's the same, basically the same goddamn thing in every case, and it's a lie. But in this case, that's exactly what they did. We raised cancer. And the BOP said, don't worry, Judge. We have Butner, and there's an oncology unit in Butner. And he'll be sent to Butner if he has cancer, and he will receive wonderful treatment for his cancer. Now, I think there's something else you need to know that when a person does, that's what we call an FMC, a medical center, right? That we talked about in the first story. You need to understand something about that too, which most lawyers don't know. But typically, when a client doesn't have to go to an FMC, they'll get designated to a facility based on their public safety factors. It's a risk score. And the hope is we shoot for a low risk and they go to a camp, which is usually going to be easier, more privileges, less restrictive, etc. That's what we aim for all of our clients if we can get it. And the people at a camp are generally nonviolent. Generally, there are definitely exceptions. We'll talk about that too, but it's a safer space for people. And what we don't want is for them to go to a medium security or heaven forbid a maximum a USP, a penitentiary, because those are a lot of the times the people who actually probably do need to be incarcerated because they do present a danger to others and society, right? They're violent. They've been in prison for a long time. They're predatory. They know the system, and it would be a nightmare scenario to have a nonviolent offender, especially with special needs or whatever, in that scenario. And that doesn't happen too often. But guess when it does happen? When somebody goes to an FMC, it absolutely can happen that way because anybody can go be sick. There's no prejudice when it comes to cancer, right? We all get sick. And so you could be a maximum security inmate or a camp inmate. And if you need an FMC, you go to an FMC. And the FMCs aren't segregated by class security classification. And so you could be in custody with a very violent offender. It's not unheard of at all. In fact, it happens all the time. And by the way, the same thing goes for when the BOP transports your client from one facility to another. That whole Con Air thing. Well, what happens is they start at one place and then they put them on a plane or a bus and they ship them to a way station. It's going to be usually Oklahoma or it's going to be Atlanta. Well, I'll tell you, well, put a pin in that. I'll tell you about Oklahoma and Atlanta. But what made me think of it is it's the same situation. When you're in one of those way stations, it's like Casablanca. You remember that movie? Everybody's there waiting to go someplace else. Well, in Casablanca, you can be housed with any kind of person, whether it's a white collar person or someone who may have committed a quadruple homicide. There's just no telling. So people need to understand that too. But anyway, back to my doctor. So we said all this. They said, "Oh, we got it. No problem. We'll send you to the FMC. We have a lovely oncology department there. Um, dead in 6 months. Dead of cancer in 6 months. So I guess their lovely oncology unit at Butner wasn't so lovely after all. These are true, horrible stories. Do you know what I swear to you, I just got an email yesterday from a former client of mine. And I'm going to give you his name because he's actually been on the podcast twice now. Bilal Khan. And I had him on the podcast because he's making he's a brilliant guy. And while he's been in custody, he's been making great use of his time. So he's learning the law, he's helping other inmates, and he's written two books. The first is called Surviving Pretrial, and the latest one is a guidebook to filing 2255 petitions. I'll put the link in both show notes. I'm happy to plug Bilal's work because it's pretty amazing stuff. And I love what he's doing, but he keeps in good touch with me and we speak, and I'm going to have him on the podcast again soon. But let me just read to you what he sent me. Ready? Yesterday, I get this from him. Unsolicited, by the way, while I was working on and thinking about doing this podcast for you. He says, Doug, here's a crazy injustice for you. The only way to save your own life in a federal prison is to threaten suicide. He says, did that get your attention? He said, I forgot to tell you that story. He said, I wasn't given my heart medication or any other medication for that matter for a number of days nearly 2 years ago. It wasn't until I went into suicide watch that they gave them to me. If you have a client, I guess this is another practice pointer for you lawyers, and it's the sickest one I've ever given. So file that under WTF. But here's what Bilal says, and this is a guy who's on the inside right now who knows. He says, if you have a client not getting serious attention for something like a medical issue or something very serious, it is now a strategy among inmates to go to suicide watch. The second you threaten suicide in federal prison, they get their shit together. It is unfortunate, ironic, and belongs in the Morons Hall of Fame, but it is effective, he says. Once you get to suicide watch, everyone comes to see you. The warden, the associate warden, the unit team, correctional services, etc. I think after the Jeffrey Epstein debacle, the BOP doesn't want to get caught with their pants down on suicide stuff. He asks, if only they would just fix the problems, question mark. So there's your practice pointer from an inmate on the inside at a medium or a low facility. But he says, yeah, if you're in dire straits and you're not getting your medicine, which a lot of people don't get their medicine on time, and sometimes they don't get their medicine at all because whatever medicine they were taking on the outside is not, quote, on formulary, end quote, meaning they aren't willing to pay for it. They've got some other substitute medicine that they're going to give you and hope for the best. I mean, can you imagine that? We talk about the dehumanization and how crazy punishment, punitive prison is. But for anyone who's had a serious medical condition, you know how valuable it is for you to have a trusted physician, to have access to the right dosages of the right medications, and to be able to guarantee you're taking them on time, on schedule. None of that matters to them. Or maybe it matters, but they just aren't equipped to carry it out. And then you get so desperate, you have to tell them you're suicidal to get the attention you need. And by the way, suicide watch is certainly no picnic. From what I understand, you're going into isolation. You're not going to be given bed sheets or anything that you could use to hang yourself, etc. I don't even think you're wearing clothes at that point. They put you in a paper little gown, like a little paper sack hospital gown, and take away anything that you might use to do self harm. So you're cold, you're alone, and you're begging for medical help. And you're only there, you only had to threaten suicide because BOP isn't doing their job. So how sick is that? But this is what we're sending our people into, nonviolent people with small sentences. And let's talk about some more of that. So remember I said Atlanta and Oklahoma? So the client that went to Terminal Island, first he stayed in a holding facility here in Arizona. Then eventually he was transported to Oklahoma to the hub where they ship everybody out to their final destination, except that place was overcrowded. They had no room for him. So they had an overflow contract facility. That's a core civic facility, the Cimarron Correctional Facility in Oklahoma. And Google that, and you'll see what a horror show that place is. Some of the worst riots in the history of prisons and jails happened there, and it's just a bad place. Nobody would want to be there in their worst nightmare. And this client, for a white collar nonviolent offense, gets sent there and literally housed with another individual who was there for multiple murders. Apparently, allegedly killed his family and a police officer. So we have a nonviolent white collar young man housed with a murderer in the same cell. What could go wrong? Thankfully, nothing for him, and he eventually made it to his destination where he met the poor gentleman with the heart problems who dropped dead. I had a case where a client went through Atlanta, and he had autism spectrum disorder. And I've talked about that in a million podcast episodes, and we need to be more aware of those issues too. But this client was skinny. He was immature, childlike. He looked kind of like a 12, 13, 14-year-old boy. He was maybe 21, 22 years old, probably 130 pounds soaking wet, very naive, very lost, had never been away from home his entire life until he was taken into custody. And one of his great concerns was that he had a stuffed animal that he had with him every day his whole life. That shows you his maturity level, his intellectual functioning. And he missed his stuffed duck a lot being in the Bureau of Prisons. But of course, his concerns got worse when he went to Atlanta because, again, he was put in a cell with a violent predator, probably a sex offender, I don't know, who violated him in the cell. Because again, when you go to those way stations, they're not separating people by their classification. Last story today that I wanted to talk about, and I could do several podcasts on this case. In fact, there is a podcast already on this case. If you want the background of what I'm talking about, we call it the Back Page case. It was a very high profile federal case involving the publishers of the New Times and the Village Voice. It was a national media conglomerate, but the executives, people that ran the paper, were based here in Arizona. And part of the paper is the back page where they advertise for adult services. Some of them, most of them, I think, totally legal adult services, massage, escort, that sort of stuff. But of course, there's prostitutes that will advertise their services on those papers too. And notwithstanding the paper's best efforts to screen those ads and remove them, and even report time and time and time again suspected human trafficking, sex trafficking, child trafficking to the FBI and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the government had the target on their backs for years, and they kept getting, sued or prosecuted and winning on First Amendment grounds because there is First Amendment protection for those kinds of advertisements. And they got sound advice from their attorneys that what they were doing was legal. They were never intending to promote prostitution and certainly never intending to promote child trafficking. In fact, they were doing everything in their power to make sure that didn't happen. But notwithstanding that, the government in Arizona got an indictment, got their hooks in them, took them to trial. First trial was a mistrial. The second trial, on the eve of trial, one of the defendants, presumably from the stress and strain of the government's persecution of them, took his own life. He killed himself. And his best friend, that guy's name was Larkin, and his best friend is Lacey. Lacey was the head of the paper. I'm not talking out of school. You can Google all of this. The podcast is incredible, by the way. It's called Hold Fast. It's about Mr. Lacey. It's on Audible. It's so fascinating. But this was such a travesty of justice. So on the eve of trial, Mr. Larkin takes his own life. The rest of the folks go to trial. A couple, at least two of the defendants were fully acquitted. A couple of the defendants were convicted on some counts. Mr. Lacey was convicted only of one count for an international money laundering or something very tangentially related to this whole thing. And so the point is this: what does this have to do with Bureau of Prisons? I will tell you. I was sitting in at the sentencing in that case. It happened in Phoenix. And these gentlemen had been out on pretrial release for years. I think the case started in 2018. So they have been on pretrial release for 6 years, meaning that in order to get out on pretrial release in the first place, a judge has to make a finding that you are not a flight risk or a danger. So, of course, that finding was made. And for 6 years, they proved exactly that. They showed up diligently for all court appearances. They had no trouble. And, if they wanted to flee, they had every opportunity to do that. But of course, they weren't doing that. They were showing up to court each and every time, including for the big day of sentencing. Now, normally what happens is when a person has been out of custody the whole time and they go to sentencing, the judge will, there are exceptions, especially in more violent offenses and things like that, but most always the judge will allow them to self surrender to the Bureau of Prisons, meaning they get sentenced and then their file goes to the BOP, and the BOP has time 30 days, sometimes more, could be 60, to decide, well, what's the best place for them based on their offense, how long they have to serve, their PSF, their public safety factors, all that. And when that happens, the client is allowed to self surrender, meaning, okay, say it was Terminal Island in California. They get a date for self surrender, say 60 days from now, and they get notified this is where you're going to go to serve your sentence. And they just go to California on their own and they show up to the BOP and say, here I am, I'm ready to start serving. And that is almost always how it's done with someone who's out of custody, no problems, especially for 6 years. But guess what? That's not how it was done in this case. No, the government was ready to exact not just their pound of flesh, but probably their ton of flesh. I mean, they were seeking 20 years of prison for these guys. But what they were seeking specifically on this day at sentencing was that they not be allowed to self surrender, that they be immediately taken into custody by the U.S. Marshals to begin serving their sentence. And here's why the government did that. They wanted these men to hurt. They know that it's easier to self surrender to the facility because then you avoid going first to a federal detention center holding facility. It's probably going to be CADC down in Florence, Arizona, which is not a nice place to stay. There's no programming there. There's no way to start, anything meaningful of your sentence. You're just sitting there waiting. And then you wait and wait and wait, and then they'll send you again to those hubs. So it'll be Oklahoma or Atlanta or wherever they're going to send you. And we already talked about what a terrible place those are. And then eventually you'll arrive at your facility of designation. But they know how uncomfortable and punitive that in between period is, and they wanted it for them. And I have never heard of that happening in a case like this. Now, here's the sick part. Are you ready? In order to justify this absurd ask, this vindictive, vengeful ask, they said to the judge, the reason why you need to take them into custody now is because they present a flight risk. But not just any flight risk, they said. This is what they argued. They present a risk of flight by suicide. The U.S. attorney literally told the federal judge in Arizona that you should take them into custody to make sure we get them before they have a chance to kill themselves. Now, if that doesn't make your stomach turn, I don't know what will. But, think about the reality of that argument. Flight by suicide. What they are tacitly admitting to, the government, is that the BOP is so horrible, so punitive, so dangerous, so dysfunctional, so dehumanizing that a person would rather kill themselves than be subjected to that torture, that level of deprivation. The government knows it. And that's what they argued. Don't give them the easy way out, Judge, because if they kill themselves, we don't get to torture them in the Bureau of Prisons. We don't get to do all that stuff. We don't get to subject them to everything we know that they're going to be subjected to: danger, poor medical care, no psychological care, substandard programming, lack of visitation. All of those things that shouldn't be happening in the BOP, but the government knows full well are happening. They're saying any rational person would probably rather just kill themselves than have to go through that. And that, my friends, dear listeners, government, your honors, that argument right there, flight by suicide, should tell you everything you need to know about the Bureau of Prisons. So the real question is, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? And again, we have to keep telling the story of prison at sentencing until the judges start paying attention. And I do have to wonder, what is going through the mind of that California judge who shrugged off the desperate pleas of the Terminal Island client and said, I'm not too worried about you. And they die. Does that weigh heavily on a judge? I don't know. I wish I could get a judge to come on this podcast. Maybe I'll find a farmer judge. That's my mission. But I guess it sort of depends on the person, because I know there are amazing, wonderful, compassionate, thoughtful, intelligent judges out there. In fact, I think most of them, especially in federal court, I'd put in that category. And then there aren't. There are some that just aren't. And this system is a lottery. The outcome of your case depends so heavily on who's your prosecutor, will they be reasonable, who's your judge, are they a decent, fair, intelligent, thoughtful human being, who's your lawyer, have they sold you a bill of goods about what they could do, and they've only handled 3 federal cases in their life and have no freaking clue how to present a sentencing, but they have a really fancy office and a neat suit, and they charge exorbitant rates, or they say, hey, I've been a prosecutor, so I know this job. Okay. That's all other podcasts too. There are some good former prosecutors who become defense lawyers, and there are some not so good ones too. The point is, it's a lottery, and I would hope that any human being judge would weigh heavily, and that next time they would give maybe more careful attention when a client gives a desperate plea backed up by documentation that their life is in serious jeopardy. But I don't know. I don't know. So we're done with story hour. Well, I guess we're not, actually, because I am the narrative guy. I'm the guy who loves a happy ending, or at least the hope for a happy ending. And so I always want to focus on anything that we can that allows us to hold on to hope. And the point is, and this is maybe the educational aspect of this podcast, but there are cases and experts and lawyers who are able to boast about breaking through that wall of indifference and getting a real result in front of a judge. And like I said, there are a lot of great judges out there who will respond to this. And you never know until you tell the story. But let me just give you some examples of that. One is there's case law. Okay, and I can put some of this in the show notes, but you can look at some examples of cases in the federal district court level, especially in the New York area, because there's two notorious federal pretrial detention facilities there. One was MDC and one was MCC. And I think MCC is the one that has since closed because it was so deplorable. That's where Jeffrey Epstein died. But that was a notoriously just god awful gulag. And then it's MDC in Brooklyn, and from by all accounts, it's just as bad, if not worse. So we're not just talking about understaffing, abuse, um, lack of supervision, lack of programming, lack of visitation. We're talking about major infrastructure issues like black mold and rotted pipes and you name it. The most dehumanizing, degrading conditions you could ever imagine in this great country of ours. Like we're talking third world country shit. And lawyers started saying either the argument is twofold. One is, the time they spent there pretrial was so unbelievably exponentially more punitive that they've done their sentence. They've served their penance. And now you can do house arrest or something else because that was just sheer horror. Um, or the other one was actually a pretrial was a bail motion where the client was arguing for pretrial release pending sentencing because the conditions at MDC were so deplorable, right? And the judge basically, there was a law based on his offense, it was a drug crime, that there's a presumption of detention. So it makes it very difficult for a judge to release a person like that under the law. And there's a beautiful written opinion by this judge saying, I am going to release this person. And the gist of it was a love letter, I say that sarcastically, to the BOP who runs these facilities that, if you can't maintain a safe and clean and orderly, productive space, place to fulfill these missions here, um, we're not going to give you these people because you can't handle them. And until you get your shit together, I don't feel the need to have this person in your custody and care, right? And so they released him pretrial, and it was all based on the deplorable conditions of a BOP run facility. So great result. And there's a lot of cases out there like that. I'll see if I can compile a list for you. One of my prison experts, Maureen Baird, she's been on the podcast a few times. She's a former warden of several BOP facilities, so she knows exactly what she's talking about. And she'll do a declaration in the case to help explain these things to the judge. And her work and her colleague, Jan Perdue, another former BOP official, and some others that I know, it's invaluable. I can't stress enough how important it is to get someone like that on your case for sentencing, especially when they have special circumstances. So here's an example of a great win that Maureen just reported. It was out of Chicago, and the client was a non-citizen, non-US citizen. And the government was seeking a sentence of upwards of 7 years. But they did a declaration, and what they did is they needed the judge to understand that because of their status as a non-citizen, they would be treated very differently in the Bureau of Prisons, meaning they would at no time be eligible for minimum security prison, which means they're going to one of those higher security prisons based on what they call the PSF, public safety factor. So non-citizen, I think they think that makes you a flight risk or something. You don't have ties. I don't know what, but they jack up your safety score, which means you go to a higher custody facility, meaning more dangerous, less privileges, harder time. And the judge was persuaded by that because of the nature of the offense. And he referred to those BOP policies, the PSFs, essentially as ridiculous, nonsensical. And the BOP had tried to come back with, everything's fine here, Judge, don't believe this nonsense. And they made a disingenuous attempt to explain that, sometime at some point down the road, they might qualify for a PSF waiver. And, the judge was not buying into it. Okay. And by the way, if the BOP makes that kind of claim, you need to challenge them on that. Oh, good. You say she would qualify for a waiver. Could you please point me to one case where you've ever given such a waiver? And I guarantee you they won't be able to do it. And in this case, out of the thousands of non-citizen inmates they had under their custody, they couldn't produce one. So the judge was smart enough um, to know that the BOP was selling them a load of snake oil. And what did this judge do? Instead of 7 years in prison, the judge sentenced this client to 3 years in a halfway house. Which anybody who knows anything about anything knows that's a heck of a lot better than being in custody. A halfway house. Home arrest or home detention would have been the brass ring, but a halfway house is the next best thing. And my goodness, that's an extraordinary result. It tells you what's possible when these issues are on your radar and when you have the right people to address them. Another great success story, my friend and colleague Walt Pavlo, who runs Prisonology, prisonology.com. Now, you've heard Walt on my podcast more than once too, and he's great. And Walt knows this system inside and out and has great consultants working for him. And they had an extradition. This is really great. They had an extradition case out of the UK, and it was a young client. It was involved, I guess, in a cyber attack. And the U.S. was trying to extradite him here from the UK, where he would face about a 10-year term of imprisonment in the BOP. And this young man had a history of severe mental health issues, multiple suicide attempts. In other words, the stakes were incredibly high if he was going to sail into the mouth of this beast. So Walt and his people provide, again, a declaration, a detailed sworn declaration or an affidavit to the court in the UK outlining all of the harsh realities that we've been talking about in the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, the overcrowding, the lack of programming, the lack of mental health treatment, medical risks, mental health challenges that have been exacerbated by COVID lockdowns, the whole litany, the whole parade of horribles. And of course, they cited to the multiple reports from the Office of Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office, and along with insights from, again, a former BOP warden. The UK, the government of the UK said, hell no, we're not allowing him to be extradited. You, America, do not have your shit together. And unless and until you do, you ain't getting our citizen. So that I'm sure they didn't say it exactly like that. I'm paraphrasing, you know how I do. But the bottom line is the UK ruled against extradition based on the horror show that the BOP is right now. So again, this underscores the impact that informed expert advocacy can make to protect any defendant, but especially the most vulnerable among our clients. And so, it tells you that, again, it's not Doug saying, "Oh, the BOP is really bad, don't do this." Now we have the United Kingdom saying, "Holy shit, no, thank you." And I think that's really, really significant, given that they're, one of our greatest allies and partners in the world. And so, congratulations, BOP. You're now an internationally recognized disgrace. I hope you're proud. Anyway, so listen, all things are possible with the right advocacy. That's what I want you to take away. That's the hope that I want you to hold on to. So let me sum it up. What do we do? What are the action items? Tell the story of prison every time, especially if you have a client with mental health or medical needs, especially if you have an aged client, for sure, or any other vulnerabilities, absolutely positively must tell that story. But you don't need a client with special needs to tell the story of how overcrowded, understaffed, lack of programming, dangerous, all of it. Judges have the power to remedy their deficiencies by refusing to send clients into the BOP. It's just that simple. And again, what are the other action items? Beware the snow job, the con job, the bullshit form letter that BOP is going to send you saying, well, it's all good. We got this. Beware of any time the BOP sends you an email or anything saying, ah, we got this. It's all good. Right? What else can you do? Call your Congress people and your senators. This is on many of the senators' radar. You know, they, like I said, they just passed this law mandating some degree of oversight. It remains to be seen how that's going to play out. I want to have some experts on here to talk to me about what they think is going to happen. But Joel Ossoff, the great senator from Georgia, is at the forefront of this. But this is on Congress's radar. And the more they can hear from constituents about the reality of what is happening inside the walls of BOP, the more chance we have of them taking remedial action. So don't be afraid to reach out to your congressman or any congressman who you think will listen. What else can you do? Hire experts like Maureen and Walt or me. I mean, shameless plug, but you know, that's the extent of my practice is sentencing advocacy. It started with mitigation videos. Again, next episode, check it out. It's amazing. But you know, it just blossomed from there. And so, you know, we are myself, my colleague Mark Allenbaugh, I work with Alan Ellis. We lawyers bring us into cases to consult with them to help them spot these issues, help them locate experts, and help them tell these stories at sentencing. So you need experts, whether it's a prison expert or some other kind of expert, right? And by the way, when do you start developing these stories and doing the research and the homework to make sure you can present these adequately to a judge when that time comes for sentencing? You got to start early, preferably at the very beginning of your case. And that's not because I'm a pessimist and think you're never going to win at trial, but you're never going to win at trial. No, seriously, most of these cases don't even go to trial. 95% of them plead out, and the ones that go to trial, you know, 1, 2, 3% will win at trial. So you're talking about a high 90% chance that you're going to be in front of a judge for sentencing. Why on earth would you not start preparing for that simultaneously as you prepare to defend the other aspects of your case? For you lawyers who like think you need to just clear the hurdle, get through a guilty plea, get a sentencing date that's 30, 60, 90 days out, and then start thinking about what you're going to say at sentencing, you've just wasted however many months or years you've had with this client to do that work too. So I say get in early, do that work simultaneously. Okay. That's an action item. What else? Um, Always present, look, if you can't afford an expert or someone like me, that's fine. Just give them all of the documentation. You could get affidavits, declarations that have already been done in other cases that give the basic information to the judge. They're on file on whatever case, you know, that an expert has testified in. There's no reason you can't pull from that if it's relevant to your situation. You absolutely have the OIG reports and those things online at your disposal, which are government investigations fully documenting these issues. So they don't have to take your word for it. They're documented from the government. Pull those NPR stories, cite to them in your memo. There's a whole mountain of support for this stuff that you can introduce to a judge at sentencing without ever hiring an expert. An expert's usually going to be a better way to go if you can do it, just because they can tailor make their declaration to your specific circumstances. But you know, I'm no fan of Donald Rumsfeld, the late defense secretary in the Bush administration, but I am a fan of one of his pithy little quotes that he so heartlessly gave in the height of the Gulf War, which I think is relevant to the work that we do. which is you go to war with the army you have, not the army you want. So if you don't have all the resources to hire experts or whatever, there's plenty of stuff you can still do. Costs nothing. Costs nothing. You just need to know about it and know where it is. And again, a lot of this stuff's going to be in the links to my show notes at setforsentencing.com. And the last action item is just continue to think outside the box in the way that you can bring these stories to life and make them meaningful to the decision makers. And that's usually the prosecutor, who is the first sentencer. Did you know there's two sentencings in every case? At least two in every case. What? What are you talking about? Well, the prosecutor, is the first sentencer in any case. Why? Because they have total discretion about what kind of plea bargain, and I'll put the word bargain in quotes, but what kind of plea offer they will make. And so if they're holding all the cards and have full discretion on what kind of plea, maybe we won't make you plead to a mandatory minimum count. Maybe we'll stipulate to a lower sentence. Hell, maybe we'll agree to pretrial diversion. Well, guess what? That's not just about how strong is their case against you. It's about who you are as a human being and what are your special circumstances. So you need to start telling that story to the prosecution early on in the case to hopefully influence what kind of a plea agreement you get. And then, of course, the judge is the second sentencer, maybe the final, but some of these cases go for post-conviction relief or pardon or clemency. And so you have a whole nother set of judges looking at the case down the road. And so you always have to be thinking about powerful, meaningful, true ways that you can tell your story to those decision makers. Maybe it's a video, maybe it's a PowerPoint, maybe it's a pleading filled with pictures, you name it. But don't just do the regular old lawyer stuff, because what got us here is not going to get us there. And as my mentor, Alan Ellis, likes to say, if you want extraordinary results, you must take extraordinary measures. And that's about all I can tell you today. I think I've been rambling for about an hour. So if you're still with me, I am grateful. I promise I won't do this all the time. Like I said, next week we'll be back with two amazing guests with a really special announcement, and we're going to talk about mitigation videos. The week after that, I have another incredible guest who's a social geographer to talk about body mapping. What is body mapping? Well, you're going to have to tune in and find out. That should be maybe a two-parter, episode 101 and 102. I am so proud and grateful that we are now coming up on 100 episodes, because that means that the work has meaning. It means that people are listening, people are supporting, and people are using this information to bring more fairness, more awareness, more humanity to the system. It's the whole reason I started this podcast. And I'm going to keep going with it as long as there's one person out there who needs the help. And so I'll see you back in 2 weeks. I would love for you to go and subscribe on YouTube to Set for Sentencing, or subscribe on the pod anywhere you get your podcasts. Hit the like button, spread the word to as many people who you think will be interested or need this, and let's get as many people on this train as possible so that we can make real change to the system. Have a great week, or 2 weeks, I guess, and keep fighting the good fight. And thank you for everything you do and for listening, and I will see you soon. Take care.